Let's talk to Alan Tolhurst, Chief Reporter at Politics Home. I won't ask you about Harry and Meghan, but the politics of the royal family are also pretty big.
Yes.
Politics at ITV, pretty big. But the politics today really about Boris Johnson and his COVID WhatsApp messages, and this deadline, 4 o'clock today, extended by Baroness Hallett, Heather Hallett, who chairs that COVID inquiry for the Cabinet Office, to hand over all those WhatsApp. First of all, they said, oh, we can't hand them over. And then they said, oh, we don't actually have them. Boris Johnson said, here you go. There they are. Is Boris Johnson just very relaxed about having to give all of his personal messages, or is he up to something? It's Boris Johnson, after all.
Yeah, I think probably more the latter than the former. But clearly, he's having a bit of fun with this because he knows what a difficult position that the government are now in. Because it's by handing it over, by suggesting that it's not the ball is not his court. He's handed over everything. He says he's willing to hand it over directly to the inquiry if needs be. But obviously, it's going via, because he's perhaps to do with government business. They are gone via the government, and the government have got to make this decision. He's hands off. It's not up to him now. It's up to the government, and he knows what a difficult position it's in, because that's exactly the position that he was in when he was Prime Minister, in trying to deal with these kind of disclosures, and the kind of as we talked about before, the precedent that it would set by handing over all of the documentations, because we know that inquiries, the scope of them often gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and this dragnet that could be created to pull in everything that was ever sent by anybody related to government, vice versa, could get wider and wider, and the government has got to decide whether they go along with Baroness Hallett's requests or whether they make a stand, which could be quite damaging in itself.
Indeed. Well, we should wait and see what happens at 4 o'clock today. Let's talk to Lord Barwell now. Gavin Barwell is the former Chief of Staff to Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. Good morning to you, Lord Barwell.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very complicated story. Who's actually got these WhatsApp? Who has to decide to hand them over? What counts as a relevant WhatsApp? And Baroness Hallett, as we've just been discussing, as the chair of the inquiry, says, I think that'll be up to me and my team to decide what's relevant. Thank you very much indeed. First question, do you have any sympathy for Rishi Sunak, the Cabinet Office, Boris Johnson even, when people say, look, handing over our phones effectively was every single WhatsApp we've been sending, whether it's about, oh, can you get me a cheese sandwich on the way back to the office, or yes, I'm madly in love with you, I want to have an affair, I'm leaving my wife messages. God knows there must have been a lot of those during that time, given this government. Do you have any sympathy that actually people should have a right to a level of privacy about those issues, given that these WhatsApps eventually could all end up in the public domain?
In normal circumstances, yes. But I think these are exceptional circumstances. So I think there are two concerns. There's the one that you've just laid out about messages that have nothing to do at all with the COVID inquiry, but to do with people's private lives. And there's also the concern about what people refer to as collective decision-making, that ministers argue about things in private before the government comes to a view. And normally we don't get to see that because government can't work unless that can happen in private. But this is clearly, Julia, an exceptional circumstance. Thousands and thousands of people died. All of us had our liberties curtailed. And the reason the government set up this inquiry was so that we could get to the truth of what happened, what the government got right, what it got wrong, what are the lessons, because it is going to happen again, as you and I know, we're going to have another pandemic at some point. They should trust Baroness Hallett. They set up this inquiry. They choose the person that runs it. Yeah. So I think, how are you as a journalist going to have confidence in the outcome of an inquiry if the government controls what things the inquiry got to see and what things were kept back from it?
I mean, and that's where it comes down to, doesn't it? Are we going to trust the results? And again, my expectation when they set it up, that it was going to be complete whitewash anyway, and would be focusing on, should we have locked down 2 weeks earlier, which I don't think is the conversation. I wonder if Matt Hancock's WhatsApps, as revealed by Isabel Oakeshott in the lockdown files, if they have actually perhaps changed the agenda there, and where we've learned so much from just his WhatsApps. Although, interestingly, as she pointed out to us on Tuesday, they didn't include the WhatsApps that were sent in the month of March 2020, which perhaps the most crucial month, because if people go back and watch, and I do implore people to do those, they're all online, you can see the videos, what was said to us, early to mid march by, likes of Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, and indeed government ministers, including Boris Johnson. And what was said a week, 2 weeks later, I mean, a complete change. There is no evidence that there was any new evidence other than Neil Ferguson's absurd computer modelling that changed anything, and yet we changed policy. So I wonder if the lack of science behind decision making might become more of the focus. But here's the thing. We need to know what happened behind the scenes, don't we? Because behind the scenes was where all the decision-making was going on. I've spoken to numerous cabinet ministers and their aides who told me cabinet meetings were held on Zoom, which we knew, but cabinet ministers were often kept on mute, unable to even discuss. The cabinet became a rubber stamp exercise, not actually a debating forum. 1970s, there were cabinet meetings that lasted 3 days when they were debating and discussing policy. But also, cabinet members, so a Secretary of State would be brought into a meeting, wasn't allowed to bring an aide, wasn't allowed to have any information in advance, and would be bamboozled in a meeting, often chaired by Michael Gove. Again, he seems to have got off scot-free on all of this. He was the man chairing most of these COVID-0 meetings with Matt Hancock, often with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance and other aides. He would be surrounded by people saying, this is what we think we should do, basically not allowed out of the room until they agreed and bamboozled. Now, if they want to choose to run government like that, and the only evidence of any proper debate is on WhatsApp, that is the argument, isn't it, that we need to know what that debate was, because it wasn't happening in the official meetings anymore.
Well, that's what we need to see. We need to understand where the decisions were taken, who was involved in taking them, what was the evidence, and not, I think, with a view of, pinning the blame on people. The point of these inquiries, I think, is twofold. One is for the benefit of people that lost loved ones, who have a right to know the truth about what happened and help them get some kind of closure. And secondly, because, as I said, this is going to happen again at some point, and we want to do a better job as a country. And, probably you and I would disagree slightly about some of the decisions that were taken, but we need to get the evidence so that those debates are well informed. Yeah. And I think that you said something which I think is right to the point, which is the world has changed a bit since the 80s and 90s. The advent of WhatsApp, ministers using that to conduct business. I suspect, Julia, if either your or my WhatsApps were published, there'd be the odd message in there that we would be embarrassed by.
Because odd message? I mean, sacked on the spot.
Yeah, okay, so we take a different tone when we communicate with people in WhatsApp than we do when we send a work email or we write a letter to people. So there's going to be some embarrassment for some of the ministers and officials involved. But the thing that I would say to them is it's not about them. It's not about them and their embarrassment. I had to give evidence to the Grenfell inquiry. And it's a very difficult thing when you go back over the decisions you made and what did I get right and what maybe should I have done differently. But these inquiries are not about the embarrassment of individual ministers. They're about the right of people affected by the decisions that were taken, people who have lost loved ones, to get to the truth of what happened, hopefully with a positive view of how can we do better next time? What can we learn from this? And so I think the government needs to get over its nervousness about what might come out and focus on that bigger picture.
And why do you think that Boris Johnson has been so eager to hand over his messages? We already had over the last couple of days this line from his sources close to him, and indeed he was sort of doorstepped at a Texan airport. Him saying this, look, I'm happy to, they've had my messages, I'm happy for them to be handed over. And yet we understand he was furious when the Cabinet Office lawyers who were looking at his messages and his records when it came to, ahead of the COVID inquiry, when they handed over information to the Cabinet Office, which they subsequently handed to the police over possible more Partygate breaches, but this time at Chequers. Now, I mean, you can't be angry at that and then be going, no, I'm perfectly happy to hand over all my messages. Has he got an ulterior motive here? He just wants to put the responsibility onto Rishi Sunak, but he's secretly hoping Rishi Sunak doesn't hand the messages over? Or does he think, is he looking at, you know what? I think there's stuff that damages a lot of other people here. The messages that we saw in Matt Hancock's cache of messages largely were the Prime Minister being sort of bamboozled into decision-making and arguing against lockdowns. Now, for me, that's not good enough. He was the Prime Minister. He should have made better decisions. I don't absolve him of any responsibility on that. But is he basically wagering either they're not handed over, or even if they are, the damage falls on everyone and not just him?
So I'm not, as you know, I'm not a member of the Boris Johnson fan club, but I actually think he's done the right thing. You should have said. But I think he's done the right thing. I think you have to be fair and give credit where it's due. I think he is taking the right line and saying this information should go to the inquiry. Now, I suspect he's privately enjoying himself a little bit at having put the Cabinet Office in a really difficult position now. But I don't think most of the people listening to this programme are too interested in the psychodrama within the Conservative Party. We've had several years of that, right? And that can play itself out. The big picture here is whether this inquiry gets the information it needs so that people like you, who are maybe a bit more skeptical of it than I would be, actually believe it's got to the bottom and got to the facts. Because what's the point of spending all this money if that doesn't happen? It would just be a waste of time.
Just finally, briefly, if you would, we found out earlier this week that, well, we know next week we're going to start here at some public hearings. But again, that's what I find extraordinary, that why are they only just now asking for all these messages? Why were they not asked for 2 years ago? That's, I think, extraordinary itself. But they're not even going to finish, not planning to finish public hearings till 2026. Who are we kidding? It'll be 27, 28. We're not going to see a report, probably, for a year or two after that. I mean, it could be the end of the decade before we see a report into this. Other countries have done their inquiries and they've finished sooner. They may have been less thorough. Is there an argument for a more, perhaps, a thorough one that takes till the end of the decade, but a less thorough one that perhaps gets to the nub of the matter rather more quickly, so that we learn lessons more quickly than we otherwise might do?
So it's definitely very frustrating that it's taking so long. I think most of the blame for that is that the government was very slow to set it up. There was quite a long period where they were holding out on having this. And it was obvious right from the start, from the first lockdown, that you were going to need a public inquiry once this was all done. As I understand it, what they're going to try and do is break the inquiry into bits, which is a bit like what's happened with the Grenfell one. So you don't have to wait to the end of the whole thing to begin getting some findings. So I think the first thing, Julia, that they're looking at is the sort of preparedness. How ready was the government before this actually happened? Did it have good plans in place? So I completely share your frustration about how long it's taken, but I do think, given we're having it, it should be done thoroughly and properly. And I think they need to think about how they structure it so we get some of the lessons quicker. All
right. Really good to talk to you, Lord Barwell, former Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Theresa May. 7:18 is the time. Up next, going to talk about, well, you think it's basically a nest of vipers in politics. Well, imagine working at ITV. We'll talk about that latest revelations over what's happening with the Philip Schofield affair up next. This is Talk Breakfast.